Corrections and Institutions. It is March 2nd, Thursday. We're going to shift gears in the capital bill, and a little bit we're going to shift gears in the capital bill, I think. We've got with us, what's your first name? Falco. I was thinking that was your last name.
That happens quite a bit.
I know. I just had this brain burp. It was just like, oh, God. Falco Schilling. There you go.
Yep.
From ACLU. They wanted to come in and testify on, we do have money in the capital bill for planning for replacement of the current women's correctional facility, and ACLU wants to testify on that proposal, and I think I brought a picture of corrections as well. So welcome, Falco.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to testify today. So for the record, my name is Falco Schilling, and I'm the Advocacy Director for the ACLU of Vermont. If at any point you can't hear me because I'm masked, please let me know, and I will try and speak up. I have a 1-year-old son at home who's bringing home about everything in the world from daycare, and so trying to put a barrier between that and all the germs in this building,
Yeah.
I think it's probably a good move going forward.
Good luck.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, it has not been working so far. He's gotten about 1 full week of daycare since September, so yeah, sounds about right. I know everyone's good. So
Makes him stronger.
let's hope.
That is yours.
So thank you for the opportunity to come in front of you today to talk about the proposal for construction of the women's correctional facility. This is a conversation that we have been following closely for a number of years. And I think for folks who have been around this building or have been on this committee before, a lot of the things that we're going to be saying today aren't going to sound all that new. But I think this was a good opportunity to raise it, especially as this committee is, a lot of this committee is newer to the discussion. And we wanted to bring in some of our concerns, specifically about the proposals you've seen in front of you, and more information that we hope the committee can gather to help inform decisions in the future. And I do also want to start off by saying, I think one thing that I felt really heartened by as I've seen this whole conversation happening both in this committee and everyone who's come to present to this committee, there seems to be a real, genuine desire to try and improve the lives of the people who are incarcerated in Chittenden Regional Correctional Facility, and as well as the people who are incarcerated through our entire system. So I think that's the spirit that I'm coming here with, and I think that's something that I've heard from everyone involved in this process, and so I just kind of want to note that before we dive in and we start talking about some of our concerns, many of which are more focused on some of the numbers, as well as just some of the other concerns more largely about design of a potential facility.
And I do want to say, Falco, that I know you've been attending a lot of the meetings, and I know you were there when HOK was doing their initial presentation, not their final presentation. And I want to say I appreciate that, because then you get to see the process, our thinking process, and how it evolves or doesn't evolve. And I really appreciate you being there for those, because this is not an easy discussion. And I think one thing that was really clear when HOK did their presentation, and it's going to be clear as this committee deliberates over the next few years, that we don't get hung up on bed counts, because there's so many moving pieces in terms of how you count a bed. A booking bed is not general population bed. An infirmary bed is not a general population bed. Beds for folks who need more medical care, geriatric care, is not a general population bed. And I think people just get so focused on a bed count that they lose track of really what those beds are designed to do. So
I hear that, and I also respectfully, I think, would push back and say that we are concerned about the bed count and what that looks like, especially when that's tied to the population projections. And that's one thing that we've seen consistently throughout the proposals coming from HOK. From their first proposal, they were looking at the overall prison population. One thing that we've seen over and over again is that their projections account for far more people than we're incarcerating now, and even more people than we were incarcerating during the
I think that's really old data. That was pre-COVID.
Their projections came in their initial report. They had both the ADP for the current, post-COVID, and then the ADP pre-COVID. And then the initial, I'm happy to share some of this, circle back to some of this data, but the overall projection was for an overall population of 1,750, when we're incarcerating 1,350 now, and I believe at that point in time we're incarcerating about 1,250. So as we look at those projections and what that might mean for construction, the size of the facility, that is a concern for us, and how that's looking to the overall building design, cost to the taxpayer, and then also what impacts that might have on the system itself. I know there's been a lot of discussion around the idea of, if we build it, will we fill it? And I know that has come up quite a lot, and that's something that we've heard from folks. And I think it's, we've heard, one, that largely this is the court system that is driving some of the incarceration. I think post-pandemic, we've seen that, right? The rise in numbers is coming largely from people who are being detained. But the DOC does have some control in the number of people who are coming in from the sentence population. And so I think we're looking at both those ends of the system. And I will say, I think it's heartening to see what's happened through justice reinvestment. Because with justice reinvestment, there really was a focus on the sentence population. And what can we do to try and help reduce the number of people in the sentence population, especially cycling through on furlough. But that process in itself was not designed to take the same type of deep look at what was happening on the front end of the courts and detention, bail, charging, sentencing, a lot of those other places where, as we talk about the overall bed numbers, we've seen a pretty significant reduction, but we believe that there's more opportunity to reduce that population even further. And so that's the larger context that we bring into this conversation. We're thinking about bed numbers is, what are we at today? What could we be at in the future? And then what are the costs if we build over? And then also, what are the incentives if we are building smaller facilities? And I think also, I guess, getting back to my larger, kind of one of our larger concerns, when we're, what we have asked in our letter to you all and to other legislators to consider is to gather more information really on 3 points before putting a down payment onto, future construction. And those main 3 things we would hope the legislature can find possibly some one-time money to study would be, 1, are there alternative designs that would be effective for these communities based, more distributed, lower security, opportunities for folks to be more connected with communities they might be re-entering into, as opposed to one centralized facility, which is co-located. So that's one thing that we would hope that there would be an opportunity to look at what models have been put in place in other places across the country, other countries, and would that be appropriate for the state of Vermont? The other thing we would like to get more information on is exactly what I was just talking about. How can we possibly reduce the prison population now and into the future, and what impact would that have on construction? And I think in our letter we lay out there's a number of different places where we see there's opportunities to continue to reduce that prison population on top of the really good work that this legislature has done, especially with the focus on the sentence population. And I think that's a place that we want to give Department of Corrections a lot of credit, especially when it comes to furlough and the changes that have been made to that system, the implementation of things like earn time and other reforms that have shown really significant reductions in a short period of time. And I think a lot of that was forced by the pandemic. And I think that's a helpful thing for us to remember.
It was done by Justice Reinvestment too.
I think it's a combination of both.
It was done by this committee prior to COVID. We did earn time.
Yep.
We did presumptive parole. We looked at furlough interrupts and the time that they churned through the system. We did all of that pre-COVID.
Yes, and I was here, and I'm very proud of that work, and I think the committee should be proud of that work. And I think it's a combination of both, and I don't want to downplay it. But if you look at the time, like after COVID hit, we saw a pretty precipitous drop. And I think some of that was coming from the judiciary in terms of who they were holding. But I think we've been seeing some of those justice reinvestment reforms really work their way through, because as you all know, you can't just pass a law and get it up and running right away. So I think we've been seeing those things work their way through. And I think that's also why we're seeing that sentence population stay relatively flat as we're moving forward. And I think we will see, especially with things like earn time, as we move forward, I think we can still see some reductions there, but also see reductions in the detained population, which I think is a big concern for folks right now. And then I guess the third thing that we're hoping that this committee can think more about, and not that you haven't been thinking about it now, but every timeline for construction is a few years out. And I think we're focusing on what opportunities are there now to help improve the lives of the people incarcerated within the Chittenden Regional Facility and then other facilities as well. And that might not necessarily only revolve around buildings and designs, but other policies that can be implemented and other things that help improve quality of life. So those are things we're hoping that you will, either this committee, because of your jurisdiction over the correction system, could help move forward in terms of trying to collect that information. who will help inform any future decisions about construction. So that's kind of the high level ask that we have. I saw that there's a question. I'm happy to take questions, and then I'm also happy to talk a little bit more about some of our concerns about the actual design of the facility itself.
Okay, so let's take some questions up to this point. Tristan?
Thank you, Falco. Your letter to us that you posted, the letter we have in front of us says, we urge legislators to reject the administration's prison construction proposal and answer 3 critically important questions before committing more taxpayer dollars to construction. Number 1, what alternative, lower-cost, community-based facilities and reentry programs would serve the majority of Vermont's incarcerated population sooner and more effectively than under this proposal? And my question is, I think we are already seeing that there are not facilities that do reentry, that do community-based programming effectively. That's evident that the facilities do not exist. And what I've heard and seen from this plan is that this is the administration's attempt to answer the questions you're asking there, number 1. So what are you seeing in the plan that doesn't answer that question you're asking us to look at?
So I think the way that question has been answered within this proposal is that looking at building a new singular facility to house the people who are incarcerated at, 2 facilities put into one, 155 secure beds, 30 reentry beds. Those are the numbers that were presented.
I don't believe those are quite the numbers there.
Those are the numbers that were presented on, I believe it was February 12th.
It was lower than that. And again, I think we really have to be careful when we talk about beds and what those beds are used for. We have to be very careful about that, and that's where this committee does its due diligence to understand the moving pieces when we talk about beds for that. So.
Do you want me to continue?
Well, I agree with Madam Chair that the bed count to me was not the focus of that presentation. The planning process was, and I think the planning process gets at what you're asking here. So I'd like to understand better if you think there's something missing.
What I think is missing is discussion of could we be looking at smaller, more distributed, lower security facilities throughout the state, and how many people would need to be in a high security facility. Where you look at that, what the proposal is, the majority of the beds are secure beds. I think it's about, at least from the proposal that was put forward in front of this committee and the slides that I have, it's about 1/6 of the total facility would be reentry beds. And
16%, I believe. Not 6. I believe it's 16%.
So about 16% would be reentry beds. So what we're asking is, how many people would need to be in that higher level, more secure setting? And could they be better served in lower security community settings throughout the state? Is that an option? Is that something we could be looking at? And I know.
So are you saying just to do the incarcerated piece and not do the reentry piece? And let the reentry piece be done on a community basis?
Well, what I'm saying is I think within the incarcerated population, there could be opportunities for different types of facilities still under the supervision of the Department of Corrections that would provide different opportunities for people to reintegrate in their community with a lower security and the lower security setting. So when we talked to some of the folks who've been incarcerated in Maine, they talked about some of their concerns they had with that facility, and they talked about other options that they've had within that system where they were in more community-based settings, where they could go out to the store during the day. They could do things like that. And I think what do those options look like is basically what we're asking, are there options outside of this one facility that could be considered? What are the costs? And so we can put those head to head. So I think that's largely what that question is asking, and I hope that answers your question.
So if I can summarize what I'm hearing, you're seeing that your interpretation of HOK's report is that it's focusing on a centralized facility, and you'd like to see more that potentially broken up.
Yes. I think that's a fair summary.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
Troy and Michelle?
I'd like to focus to your third prompt. Right, so even if we don't pause this money train, it's still going to be a few years before construction starts, right? And if we do pause the money train, that just is essentially a commitment to keeping the women's facility currently active. So you're suggesting meaningful changes that can be done to improve the lives, and I think those need to happen either way. And I'm curious to know if you have a list of like most requested, or is there any work or conversations being done about, regardless which direction this conversation goes, what can be done right now in that facility to, I'd say, add a more humane approach?
Well, one, I don't want to speak for the people, right, who are incarcerated in Chittenden or in other facilities. I think it's important that their voices really inform what those changes might be, but I can share some of the things that I've heard in terms of things that people think might be helpful, but I think as the committee dives into that, and I agree, I think that's something regardless of what happens. I think that's the question. And I think the committee is asking that question all the time, and I think needs to continue to ask that question. But some of the things that I've heard, I think we've heard a lot of complaints about the grievance system. I know that is getting improved right now, right? But I think that there is an element of trust and verify. Make sure that system is up and running and feels sufficient for folks. Looking at the pay for people who are incarcerated, that's one thing that we hear about. The low levels of pay and what does that do in terms of the ability to support loved ones on the outside, to build a nest egg to help them with community reentry. Other things we've heard is just improved supports for things like mental health and substance abuse. Talking, and then also on top of that, looking at like how many people need to be in there, can people be decarcerated? And then, so those are just like a couple of the things that we have heard and I think are worth considering. And I know you've also heard things, and I know this committee has done some work on this already, but things like air conditioning, right? Like that's one thing that when I talk with folks at the VSEA, they make sure that I am thinking about that, but I also know that this is something the committee's talked about and thought about.
And we put money in our capital bill.
Exactly.
Mhm. I just want to let the committee know we've been doing a lot of this. Michelle?
Yeah, so I'd like to circle back to the first question, about alternative community-based facilities. I think the truth is that we've spent a lot of time this year and in previous years looking at the versions of a new facility that HOC has come forward with. And there's no doubt that if you compare CRCF to the HOC proposal, it's hugely preferable in terms of if you're going to just compare those two, the HOC model is preferable. But that said, before we would go full swing with a $71 million centralized location, we really haven't spent time looking at alternatives in terms of community facilities. So for example, last week I got to visit CRCF for the first time. And I was talking with some of the people that work there, and they mentioned that there were 3 women on life sentences and 7 people on sentences of 7 years or more. So 10 people are going to be there for 7 years or more. And everyone else was there for a shorter time. And 60 of the people that were there were detainees. So in terms of what you're talking about with community models that would maybe, instead of having 100 or 150 bed facility, that's way better than the 100-some bed facility we have right now. I really do think it makes sense to explore, do we need a smaller incarcerative facility and some other options which we really haven't explored as a committee. And the problem is that it's so time consuming for the people that are there for 10 years. I don't want those women in that facility indefinitely. And so it's tricky. How do we make better conditions for the people who have long sentences without limiting ourselves to the model that we have now and just kind of making some improvements around the edges? So I don't know. I think it's a hard question, but I would absolutely love it if we would have some opportunity to explore other states, other countries that have done these community models, because there are cases where they have worked, and we really haven't had time to explore that. It's not really a question, it's a comment, I guess.
Chip and then Wayne.
So I sort of agree with what Michelle had just said. We have heard of other countries that have taken a very different approach in corrections. And I think that for the most part, corrections are trying to get there. But if you suggest that, so the problem is, as Michelle had said, if we renovate the women's facility right now, we're spending millions of dollars to do that. And then trying to make more permanent changes to to use that much softer approach to corrections, then it inhibits our ability to move forward from those millions of dollars of renovations that's happening. That's what I see the committee faces. I mean, we really understand that we need a change in the way we incarcerate people and the way we prepare them to return to the community. We understand that. Getting there is really the problem that we're all facing right now. And we would love to be able to move forward much quicker on that. But it is a difficult position. And, and I agree with you. And I think that we do need to do something, but it's just trying to figure out what is the issue. I think is where we're at right now.
Wayne?
Of course, I've been arguing that we need to look at the whole picture. But I do realize that if we stop the project, given the timelines that we have for getting something built, then we postpone getting things done long term. The other issues are that, we're considering when we're looking at new facilities, the geriatric needs, the health needs, and all these other needs. And that's a lot easier to accomplish in a centralized system than if you parse them all up. You're probably going to lose many of those services in some of those locations. Besides the ergonomics of having staff, centralized unit versus having staff for multiple units, you're likely to greatly increase the staff numbers. But we haven't had those discussions to flesh it all out. Logically, those things would all come into play. And so, I would always be very hesitant to stop the process because to start back up is not easy.
Well, I guess just to respond to that comment, I guess one thing that I would say is, I think our major concern is putting dollars towards construction. I know that's not what's in front of you right now, but that is what's proposed for FY25. That is for putting that money away for construction. In the meantime, there could also be parallel tracks of information gathering. That is something that could happen. But I do think before making that decision about putting more money towards construction, it's worth gathering more information to have making a more informed decision. So I think that would be my response to your comment.
I agree wholeheartedly. Thanks.
We got more questions. Chip has a follow-up, and then Connor, interest.
I mean, it just occurred to me that, this change in approach is not only to the benefit of inmates, but we're facing a critical staff shortages in our correctional facilities that exist right now. And I think we've taken information and it has been established that this change in approach in corrections benefit staff as well as inmates. And the whole recruitment and retention issue that exists in the Department of Corrections right now could actually benefit from this as well. So it's really a two-sided issue or a two-part issue that we're really trying to approach here. And, I think it's imperative that we do make some progress in that respect.
Yeah, I think what I would say to that is I think we're in full agreement that taking an approach where we look to see how many people can be in a less secure setting that's more humane and better for both the people who work in the facility or incarcerated there. I think that's overall an approach we are in agreement on. I don't think that there's a lot of fighting happening there. I think what we were also saying is that could those types of facilities be existing throughout the communities and throughout the state as opposed to one centralized facility, and that those facilities could also maintain those same values that might also help the people who are working there as well as the people who are incarcerated there.
So if I can interrupt.
Yes.
Who would own those facilities?
I think that's part of that's part of the information gathering that needs to happen. Could it be working with? I mean, I think those would be facilities that would have to be staffed at least by the state of Vermont. But I think it's worth investigating: are those facilities that we might be able to build, or are there existing resources that could be used for those types of facilities?
Do you have communities that would be willing to come up to the plate to house those?
I don't have sign-ons from communities across the state right now, but I think this is worth investigating.
And would these facilities be holding folks with a sentence, or are they holding detainees?
I think primarily you'd be looking at the sentence population, understanding there is going to be a need for some sort of facility for detainees with their status of being and their need to cycle in and out more quickly. But I'm thinking more about the sentence population And then also just the overall conversation of how many people need to be in that type of secure facility.
Connor and then Tristan.
Yeah, thanks, Falco. Do you mind like kind of fleshing out? I'm having a tough time getting my head around exactly what like a successful sort of community-based facility looks like. Like what type of staff would be there? Would it be like locked during certain hours? You know, how big would like one be? You know?
So I can't flesh out every single piece of the operations. But part of what we're saying is we want to look into these alternatives. Where do they exist and how do those models work in other places? Like I'm not coming to you today with the blueprint, but I think these are what we, since this process started, this is what we've been asking for. And I'm really glad that folks are listening to this because I think that investigation can be happening and can give us more information about how we can decide how to proceed going forward. And then I think, I think with some of the models we've seen from the reentry facility, look, that facility is meant to be 30 beds with the possibility to upscale to 50. Could we have more facilities like that across the state? And with that type of population, and how many descendants people could also be housed in these types of facilities, more distributed, more closer, similar to what we do now with a more distributed system, where people are closer to communities that they're trying to enter.
Sorry, it's probably an unfair question. Like, you think like, could you retrofit an apartment building or something that already exists to save on construction costs? Or
I can't speak to the construction costs, but I've seen in other places things like retrofitting school buildings, dormitories, things like that, which, as we've seen a number of small institutions across the state closing, those are opportunities. But I think you could look at retrofitting a building like that. As we've been talking about the lower security needs of many of these people, could some of those facilities exist within the community?
Thanks, Falco.
Tristan?
We have assets today 1,237 male incarcerated persons in the sentence population. That doesn't count 360 male detainees.
The 1237 does not count the
Detainees.
detainees?
So
And that includes, that's just the males.
we got 124 male out of state today, 1,113 in-state male, 107. What are your, if, let's say we delay this planning process, it's a planning process we're in right now. You said you don't have the blueprint. Well, we don't have the blueprint either. We're working on the planning. This is bubble diagram stuff. So if we delay this planning process further, where do you think the 1,237 males fit into your priority level?
I think if we're looking at the system that could work for females who are incarcerated, you should also be looking at how could that be adapted to the male population as well. Because how many of those people could be housed in a lower security setting? And I think this is something when you look at the larger HOK report, they're also envisioning a lower security reentry facility for men. And could similar facilities exist across the state for men as well? And I think that's part of the planning process and can inform how we're looking at the system as a whole going forward. This is, as folks have heard and have said many times, like this is a 50-year decision. And getting more information about how we look at that system for men as well as women is very important. So I think I wanted to clarify that we're not only asking for some of this information as it relates to the women's population, but as it relates to our incarcerated population as a whole. And I think that would be my answers. I think you could take that information and apply it to future planning for working with male population.
Thank you, and I fully agree, which is sort of was the point of my question. And to me, I think we need to move this along because we have so many iterative needs down the road, both for facility and programming, that to put in planning money now to move this forward to meet benefits the entire population, which sorely needs it. And perhaps it sounds like you perhaps agree.
Well, I think what I would say is if we're in a planning stage, can there be other resources to get more information and more planning? Our concern is putting money towards construction of this new facility without looking at these alternatives. And what would that mean based on, because I think looking at the actual, I've gotten into the numbers a little bit of our concerns around what we've seen from HOK and their proposal for the women's facility. And I think one of the larger ones is just the balance of secure beds compared to reentry beds, which is largely, I think, where a lot of people want to go. And what is really of interest to many people on this committee and others is how do we create a system that looks more like that for more people within our system. So I I think that there's an opportunity for possible parallel planning. But I think that that's information would be valuable for the community to gather.
Are we banking the construction money anyway? We're not gonna be
We're not gonna
constructing.
put a shovel in the ground
We're
for at
banking
least 2
money.
years, at least, because you gotta figure out where you're gonna house it. And I understand what you're saying about spreading it out through the state and different communities. Who's gonna be owning those buildings? Who's gonna do the renovations in some of those buildings? And who's gonna staff them? And if it's a sentence person being housed in there, what is the level of security based on their behavior? Because that's what the level of security is for a correctional facility. It's not based on the conviction, crime they were convicted of. It is based on their behavior. And our facilities are medium. It's hard enough just to cite one facility of any size in a community to have everything spread out through the state. I just don't know what communities would come up to the plate and who funds all of this. If it's DOC operating and DOC's or state-owned buildings, that's a terrific cost to the state to renovate or build. I just.
The difficulty, just think about the difficulty of building a really great reentry volunteer community-based programming in one location in Chittenden. That's the best program probably, and that's in one location. So we're talking about developing quality programming across how many locations?
I mean, I think that's one thing we'd have to figure out, what would be appropriate.
Well,
So just look at the numbers here for the women. I just did a rough sketch. We got and Isaac, I know you folks have the numbers for today, and maybe Troy and Tristan pull it up electronically. But for the women, they're usually around 110. About 60 of those are detainees. So that leaves you about 50 sentenced. And of those 50 sentenced, according to what Michelle just said, 10 to 15 of them have long-term sentences. So you have 35 folks left that might be eligible for a reentry program. That's what you got left. You got to place the detainees somewhere because they haven't been sentenced, but they've been sent there by the courts. The sentenced folks have minimum and max. Some may just have life. We don't know. Those are set by the courts. What we have put in place is when someone reaches their minimum, they are eligible for furlough or presumptive parole. And we've kicked in presumptive parole to help move people out. So an incarcerated person that's going to be in the reentry facility has not even met their minimum yet. And what would determine a person going to a reentry program is their level of behavior while they're incarcerated. It wouldn't necessarily be what they're convicted of. So then you have to look at those finer numbers of 35 or 40 or 25 that would be eligible. How many of those would really be eligible for reentry? That's what we're working with right now for the women. Males, a little different story, but the courts are sending the people to DOC. The question is, how does DOC provide those beds? Because they need a bed. If you got a detainee, you got to put them somewhere. You can't put them in the back of a sheriff vehicle. You got to put them somewhere, whether we like it or not. So that's our quandary here. And we know that we have a building, not just for the women, but there are buildings for our male incarcerated population that they're old, they're outdated, and they're not flexible enough to provide the change in corrections policy and programming. And that's our problem that we have to resolve. And we've got folks who are convicted by the courts that have to be held somewhere. And I just would like to see what communities would be willing to come up to the plate and convert one of their old school buildings that's in a neighborhood that would be willing to do this. So we can think out of the box. I'd like to see if there's any communities that would be interested to do that model. Because that's the reality of it. That's reality. So, anything else on this piece, the three questions that they've put on the table to be addressed? Michelle?
I guess I wouldn't mind hearing a little bit more on the third one. You mentioned when you were talking about how to meaningfully improve the lives of incarcerated people. I'm wondering if you could speak at all to the idea of folks who are incarcerated, the high level of substance misuse and treatment, because there are places like even Maine, which we hear about as a model all the time. They said they do 20 hours a week of substance use treatment with their folks. And we don't have that available here. So I'm wondering, is there anything you could say about that? Because I do feel like, I mean, again, when I visited the CRCF last week, I think they said 80% or 80 people or 80%, it's a pretty close number, were on the MAP program. So there's a huge number of the women and the men that's an issue for them. So do you have any thoughts about that? Because it feels like that's a key issue to get at in terms of impacting recidivism.
I think what would be best is for the community to hear from folks who are providing some of those services to people inside the facility now. I think they'd be better suited to speak to that in terms of where they feel like those deficiencies might be and what improvements need to happen. I hope that some of the provider community who shared some of the concerns that I've raised today in other situations could come in front of the committee, and I can encourage them to reach out to you to try and provide some of that information to help inform those discussions. But we are not a direct service organization in that way. And I think it would be helpful to hear from some of those folks who are specifically working within the facilities and doing that type of work around where they feel like those deficiencies might be.
One of the big deficiencies is when someone here in the state, when someone is on MAT and then they transition to the community, there's a delay there for their Medicaid to kick in, and there's a delay to kick in with a hub or a scope to continue the medication. That's part of it. So you had, I've got to scoot out for 1 second. You had more that you wanted to?
I think that largely summarized what I had to say today. You all have the letter that we presented. And I guess my last piece is just following off of what you said. I do hope that there's an opportunity to hear from some more folks who are both working within the facilities now, ideally hearing more from some of the incarcerated folks of what they think would be able to help meaningfully improve their lives in the short term, because no matter what happens with this planning, I think getting more information from directly impacted people is very important. And then I also would say when we're looking at the main model, I think it's helpful to get more information there. Like we've had some conversations with folks who have been incarcerated there, and they have raised some of the concerns about how that facility works and things like co-location and whether that is actually beneficial for changing culture and how that impacts them. Things like how meaningful the jobs are that they get in the community. What we've heard is a lot of folks just end up at Dunkin' Donuts. And so I think that's important. I think also just talking about how to improve lives of people now.
Is there something wrong with a job at Dunkin' Donuts?
I think if you're trying to build larger skills, and that's what I think we're hearing quite about, building skills that can help transition into different industries when you're on the outside. I think that's one of the places where you can look at other opportunities as well.
My first job was on the grill at McDonald's, and I thought it taught me a lot of great skills. And like it or not, employers like that are important in many of our communities and offer good jobs. And the fact that they're willing to work with our facilities, I would take that as a plus. And I disagree with the shade that was cast at that just now.
Well, I apologize if it was taken in that way. I do think what we heard from folks is they were looking for different types of opportunities, and and so that's what I was trying to present.
Well, I thank you for clarification. I did hear that there were a lot of connections with farms and outdoor businesses in that community, so that's part of where I'm coming from. A mix of businesses sounds healthy to me. I'd personally be interested in the testimony you're discussing.
Yeah, I can reach out to folks and see if they'd be willing to, they spoke to us and said, please don't identify us at this point in time, but I'd be I'd happily reach out to them and see if any of them be willing to come and speak to this committee. And I think the other concern they raised is just the number of people who are actually, percentage of folks within that facility actually going out and working in the community. The rough estimate that they gave us was, more like a quarter of the folks are actually working in community as opposed to working within the facility. And so I think, one, looking at the programming there, how it's working, and then two, thinking about how we could be moving towards more opportunities to work within the community now, even if folks are incarcerated at Chittenden, which is a place where you have employers in proximity, you have proximity to transportation, which are things we've heard are important. And I think, how do we build out that system now? Because one thing we've also heard is that it took a lot in terms of culture change in Maine to get to a place where they were able to have this type of facility, and like, what is the work that's happening to enable that now? And how can we apply it to the population regardless of where they're incarcerated?
Wayne, you had a question?
Just spin off and what Tristan was talking about. We got education and training going on inside, but facilities we have now aren't really set up very well for that. And we also have to think that if we're going to build a new facility, a larger facility would be a lot easier to have those more diverse training opportunities than if you spread them all out. You're not going to be able to deliver those kinds of services or have necessarily the scale of space available designed for those purposes. It'd be more difficult.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's worth looking at is what are those opportunities? What are other population, like where can we site these in existing population centers? And then also I think we go to looking at where is retention and recruitment also of staff harder and or easier in terms of, because I think one of the things we've heard is that like the northwest corner is a sector that is hard. And that's where the plans are focusing now. So this is just another flag that we're working.
Anyone else? Michelle?
Yeah, just a quick question related to the third one again in terms of substance use. I feel like I've heard that there are places where the courts will actually consider substance use struggles, and perhaps you can do something like being sentenced to go to treatment and then being on probation afterwards. Are you familiar with any examples like that? Because I personally would love to research into that, but I don't know specifics. I just have heard that models like that exist.
I can follow up and provide you some information after this.
Okay.
I'd rather not just opine on the stand without having the information from.
Okay, all right, great.
Nothing else? Thank you, Falco.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Thank you for the opportunity to talk with you.
Yep. Thanks for coming in. Joe Aja is due next. I don't see him unless they're in the hall. Eric?
I'll go grab him by the ear, sir.
Okay. Running a little behind.
Okay, 5-minute break.
Goodbye.
5-minute break.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Sorry.
So, Michelle, used often in like DUI 3 cases, which have mandatory jail sentence.
Yeah, thank you.
The intensive substance abuse program. I think that's still in effect. It's a furlough program that will provide intensive treatment to those in the community.
How often do we use that?
Pretty often. I've made those arguments really often on those type of cases.
Eric was just saying he didn't feel like they used it very much.
It may have changed,
Yeah.
I've been gone for 9 years now, so, but we used it a lot. Because it would satisfy some of the mandatory, yes.
Yeah, we gotta get off of YouTube.
Oh,
We're done, right?
well, I thought the schedule says Joe is coming back in.
I know, but there's nobody in the room.